our plots go through the same constraints that growers are going through out there. And so we look back in the data and we try to see what would have been the best management to have taken this season.
If you do get it in early, you've got the right variety, you produce more forage for grazing as well. So that's been a kind of a win there.
If you're going in with a goal of having some forage if you need it, in Oklahoma we saw that, and that was kind of an exit opportunity for many producers.
That was from a roundtable discussion about the 2026 wheat crop. Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. I'm Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. Got a chance to do a fun conversation here. We've got a number of guests lined up around the table for this episode. I want to introduce a couple of people. Romulo Lollato, he is K-State's Research Extension Specialist for Forage and Wheat. We've got John Kirkegaard, who is a farming systems agronomist with the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization based in Canberra, Australia. And then we've got the man behind the control board here that you never see, Dave Deken, who is the producer of the Wheats on Your Mind podcast, and he comes from Oklahoma. And what I thought we'd do is do a roundtable discussion about the 2026 Kansas and Oklahoma wheat crop. I think it's something, gentlemen, that I've not seen the likes of in my 20-year career with Kansas wheat. Certainly, probably not in my 53 years on the planet Earth. We came out of 2023, which was a disaster crop by any standard in Kansas, 30% abandoned acres due to drought. But I think 2026 was different in many ways. In 2023, even though Kansas had a bad crop, it wasn't necessarily widespread. There were other states in the southern and central plains who had a good wheat crop. 2026 was devastating in the sense that we started with a good-looking wheat crop in the fall, I believe, and then things went downhill from there, and it was so widespread. So ultimately, we've ended up with the smallest hard red winter wheat crop in the United States in well over 50 years. So that has serious implications for farmers, obviously, and serious trade implications and things like that. But so let's take a look back, talk about what happened, and maybe some perspective on what moving forward. Romulo, why don't we start with you and just kind of give us a scenario of how things look like last fall, and then maybe we'll turn it to Dave and he can tell us about what happened in Oklahoma, and then John, we'll bring you in. And you're unique in that you're here on a Fulbright scholarship opportunity, and you've been here since March, so you saw the evolution of the crop too and can compare it to maybe what you've seen in the past in Australia. So Romulo, you give us the first go.
Yes, this last season was, to me, it was kind of like a season of hope and despair. Right,
perfect.
So we actually started off in a really good shape. If we think back of the crop in the fall, we had some precipitation in September in parts of the state that allowed for some of the timely planting of the crop out in western Kansas. Good emergence, good stand establishment. In fact, southwest Kansas was looking really good. In many years, that part of the state is really tough to get a crop established there because of fall drought. And then we had a little bit of a gap, a window there where it allowed for growers to harvest their soybean crops or their corn crops and then sow their wheat crops as well. And then towards later in October, we started picking up rains again, which really led to almost a perfect stand establishment, right? That good fall moisture allowed for the crop to grow during the fall well as well. Temperatures were above average during the fall by 4 to 6 degrees or so, and so that allowed the crop to tiller out and develop a good root system. So really, as we got to December, we were probably looking in an excellent shape as we hadn't in years, and that's where the hope came in, right? Because as you mentioned, 2023 was really tough. 2024-5 were super variable as well, and so we are kind of in need of a good wheat crop there. So going into the winter, the crop was actually in great shape. Actually, we were hearing of some growers in western Kansas thinking the crop was probably even too big, right? And afraid it could use too much water, which they end up being correct in that. In terms of fall concerns, I did hear from a few growers in south central Kansas who were seeing even a little bit of waterlogging there because of those October rainfalls. And important to think that back in the fall, I think that the intent to plant wheat was probably close to that 7.7 to even 8 million acres or so across the state. And we got to 7.3, and part of that was because it got too late and too wet, and growers just probably didn't finish all the area that they wanted to plant the wheat crop last fall. So excellent conditions going into the winter, probably 3, 4, 5 or more tillers out there. It gives us a good winter kill protection there, right? And so we were in great shape. Now, from then, what happens is that it simply became dry, right? Any precipitation kind of like shut down there in that early November part of the fall, and temperatures were above average as well. I was just reviewing this yesterday. Temperatures through the winter were again up to 8 degrees Fahrenheit or so on average for the entire winter, higher than average, but across the wheat growing region more between around that 4 degrees Fahrenheit above average. Now, what does that do? I always like to contextualize that the reason why Oklahoma and Texas are able to graze their winter wheat through the winter is because they have a warm winter. So the crop never really stops growing. It's always putting a little bit of biomass there. It's not going into reproductive development, but it's growing, right? And so it produces forage. It allows growers to let their cattle graze it. And pretty much that's kind of what happened through the winter here. It was above average in terms of temperature. That crop continued to grow a little bit and continue to use moisture, right? The bigger a crop is, the more moisture it needs to stay alive there. And so it's using more water. And now remember, that's not productive use of water during that time, right? It's not like that biomass is going to turn into yield later on. It's too early for that, right? And so that biomass produced during the winter not necessarily relates to yield. So the crop continued using water during the winter. Then spring came around and the early spring rains never came, right? So it was March, it was dry. April, it was dry as well, and temperatures were still above average. If you look at the month of April only, we had parts of the state that were up to about 10 degrees or so warmer than average. That was a really hot spring, early spring, and dry. So with that, the crop just started going through drought stress, right? Because it's getting into stem elongation when it needs a lot of water, but it has already used during the winter, so the water is not there in the profile anymore. Simply as the water demand increases, the water was not there for the crop, and the crop started going through drought stress. Another thing that those warmer temperatures brought sped up crop development. So essentially, the phenology was advanced this year, which didn't help us because we had a few freeze events, right? So mid-March, we had very severe freeze down there across the state that really hurt the wheat in kind of throughout the state, but primarily I think that the coldest temperatures were northwest Kansas, and we saw a lot of leaf dieback from that March freeze in northwest Kansas, some tiller being aborted there as well. Then mid-April, we had another freeze damage, and at that point in time, a lot of the crop was already at boot or heading south central part of the state. And so traveling to see the crop in May, we're seeing so many fields showing symptoms of freeze damage from that mid-April freeze that we had. So again, a lot of heads that were bleached out and just many symptoms of freeze damage throughout that central corridor of the state. And then there was yet a third freeze that primarily hurt the crop in northwest Kansas, but that was in early May. So again, those warm temperatures during winter and spring sped up crop development, and then those freeze really damaged the crop. The temperatures in May kind of came back a little bit closer to normal, and there was a few rainstorms that came by towards the late part of the month, but they came with hail as well, right? So we went from a crop that was looking really good to a drought-stressed crop, freeze-damaged crop, and hail-damaged crop. And then the cherry on the cake was when the crop was ready to harvest, it wouldn't stop raining, right? So parts of Solomon and Salina in that region were seeing waterlogged conditions. The harvest really prolonged much longer than it usually would compared to when they started. Well, it was still an early harvest, but because the crop was early, but it was just a long and drawn out harvest because of all that rain. So yeah, pretty much anything that could go wrong with the crop.
Well, Dave, our down under in Oklahoma, where everything bad that happens in Kansas happens to Oklahoma first.
Right.
Let's not ignore the fact that what a wonderful year for grazing with cattle prices where they were. So tell us the Oklahoma story.
Well, in Oklahoma, being with Oklahoma State University for years, we always had the joke, our football team's best years were 1945, 2011, and next year. And we were really hoping for a great next year. And much like our football team this past year, it kind of puttered out when it came to the wheat crop. And we had great potential for a crop as folks were planting. I talked with a producer near Canton, which is in northwest Oklahoma, and he said he planted late because he pushed it back as far as he could because he just knew that it was going to rain, and it finally did. And I think he got maybe a quarter of an inch of rain, and then he got a snow in December, and that was it. And so he was going off of any soil moisture he had, and it wasn't great. So that kind of summed up the northwest portion of the state. And southwest parts of the state, they got the timely rainfall, they got what they were hoping for, and then it stopped. And it was probably the most varied crop I'd ever seen in Oklahoma, because you could go county by county, field by field, and it would be different. And a lot of the fields and pastures that we had, much like Romulo was saying, they were grazed. And a lot of the rougher looking fields that I saw had hot wire around them, because the producers just kept the cattle on there because they were looking at the potential price of wheat for grain, and then they would look at the price of cattle, and that was really weighing that decision. The Oklahoma wheat crop came in about half of what it usually would, and the Oklahoma Grain and Feed Association made that estimate early, and I think that may have influenced some of the decisions to keep the cattle on the fields. Now, as you went along the US 81, I mean, it looked great from the highway, but whenever you got out into the fields, the yields were not going to be what they were hoping for. Some fields, I talked with the producer, he got 8. That was his yield for the field. Dr. Amanda Silva at Oklahoma State, she cut some 40 yield bushels on some wheat, but not a lot. As you move from south to north, the crop got a little bit better up near the Ponca City, Blackwell area. There was better yields through that area. As you moved out towards the Panhandle, there were 10 bushel yields out there in the Panhandle. That's to be expected in that area, because if you're doing dry land wheat out there, you don't have a lot of rain. The only thing was it started to rain in May. Now, if we back up, a lot of the producers in western Oklahoma were hit with a 90-degree day in February, which doesn't always happen in Oklahoma, which rarely happens in Oklahoma. In Kansas, you guys were dealing with freezes. We were dealing with heat bursts, I guess. That kind of woke the crop up and said, we're ready to make a crop, and then it cooled down again. That's where a lot of producers in western Oklahoma saw their decisions being made in that time. But wheat harvest started about 2 weeks early, and it was pretty much all but done by the 4th of July, which is very rare in our part of the world. But when you have half the acres to harvest, it moves pretty fast through there.
John Kirkegaard, Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Agriculture and Life Sciences here at K-State. So you had the pleasure of coming into Manhattan, Kansas from Australia in March. So saw the crop probably at its peak, and then went on the wheat quality tour, which is the second full week in May. So being an outsider at that point in time, if you had just been thrown into your average Kansas wheat field with no background, what would your perspective have been?
Looking at the weather report when I was arriving in Manhattan to decide what sort of clothes we would bring, it was predicting 70 degrees Fahrenheit the day we arrived, but it was telling me that it was
negative 10 or
negative
so.
10 Fahrenheit the day before. So I thought there was something wrong with the weather app, but it turned out that was real. I got here just after that pretty significant freeze in March. On the wheat tour, I guess, it took me by surprise, and I'm glad you said, Aaron, at the beginning of this talk that this season's the worst you've experienced, because I'm very glad for your farmers that is the case, because I was shocked at the first crop we stopped at on the wheat tour. We went sort of out through the centre and up towards Colby on the first day, and the first crop we stopped at was only kind of a bit above ankle height, still green, but so I was a little bit surprised at how short it was. And then as we started looking at the heads and counting the heads, we saw the level of freeze damage in it. So we saw the drought and the freeze damage there pretty much on that first crop. As we went west through the centre, we stopped a little north of Cheyenne Bottoms and stopped at a farm where there were 2 crops side by side. One had been sown after alfalfa and the other after fallow. And the alfalfa there was barely a live plant in that field. And the other crop looked reasonably good. And then we sort of headed up towards Colby that day. Second day, we headed south all the way down into Oklahoma and came back along the Panhandle. And I was surprised, actually, some of the best wheat I saw on the trip was sort of coming in from sort of south of Wichita. It was not quite in the Panhandle, but I saw these crops which were just about done, pretty decent-sized heads on them. They were less heads, but good-sized heads, and I didn't really know, but I was figuring probably sown early, right, because they were going to be grazed, and probably saved because they were early, and got through, hopefully with some grazing as well, because the grower would have made some money from that, but just the earliness to escape the heat and the drought. That was a real interesting to see that variability. But yeah, and then as Romulo said, I think on the last day coming back from Wichita home, we stopped at one more field, and it had been hailed on the night before. It's all the heads broken over. So and as I mentioned, I just headed back to Australia for a little period in June, and apparently didn't stop raining the whole time. The guys were trying to get it off. So I certainly haven't seen anything like that all in the one season in Australia. I've seen pretty severe, droughts and frosts, widespread, long-term droughts. We only grow one crop a year, so we've got all our eggs in that winter crop basket, so we haven't got the opportunity to sort of pull something back with a summer crop in most of the Australian wheat belt. But what we do have is animals. So that's why the wheat-sheep system developed in Australia, because when those failures happen, the livestock can utilise the failed crops, or you can cut for hay, or you can dual purpose. And yeah, that's certainly a great tool now for a lot of Australia. The dual purpose wheat's a really good flexible option with lots of what we call exit options. Season's going with you, great, graze it, take it through to grain. If it goes well until September, well, you might get a graze and then a hay cut. But if you get a year like you guys just got, then our guys will just graze that out. But often the stock prices, if the stock prices and the grain prices are not in sync, then sometimes you can do well with the animals, and sometimes in Australia the grain price is up when you have those bad seasons, and so actually in some of those years you do a little bit better in profit wise than you might think, because the prices are okay. But when they're both down and those years happen, it's pretty significant. But yeah, I think all in all, I've gone home with a new appreciation for the challenges facing you. But I'm glad to hear that the 2026. May you never see one again, is not normal.
Well, I spoke at a Latin America's Buyers Conference last week to our customers in Central Mexico and Latin America, South America, and one question came from the audience and said, why are you so confident that the next year's crop is going to be bigger? And I said to them, I don't think you understand how hard it is to get a crop this small. In this day and age, with modern technology and with the quality of farmers we have, it's almost impossible. That was going to be my next question to you, John, comparing kind of off ramps and decision makings in a year like this, when or when not to harvest. Of course, the Kansas farmer, the Oklahoma farmer have crop insurance to take into account. The size of the wheat, the potential yield, the different off ramps that you have, but you have a few more, I would say.
Yeah, and certainly crop insurance is not as widespread and as part of the system. Certainly for hail and frost, farmers can certainly be insured for some of those things, but the multi-peril insurance and that sort of thing isn't. So the farmers pretty much sort of rolling the dice and have plans in place. So I think guys that are on properties with low-lying areas that are frost-prone, they'll have a hay business. They'll be set up to cut hay and to do that pretty quickly when that happens. And the advice on that's sort of improving all the time. The drought and the heat. I think one of the big changes in Australian cropping in recent years has been the shift to earlier sowing. So what's been happening is that our autumn rain for sowing has been dropping off. Our heat's increasing in the spring. And the response to that is, and summer rain is still there, right? So we're not doing anything in the summer, so that rain falls on sort of fallow fields. But if we can capture and store that moisture and use it as a sowing opportunity, that's really where we've shifted to. So rather than be forced to sow later and later and later and see our yield potential dropping, even though the breeders have been good at giving us quicker varieties, we've sort of stepped in the other direction and said we need to hang on to that summer moisture as best we can, and learn how to get a crop up from that deep moisture and just get it up and established. And if we can do that, it does set it up in a much better way to deal with the heat and the frost. So that's been a big shift in recent years, and that's really helping. And of course, if you do get it in early and you've got the right variety, you produce more forage for grazing as well. So that's been a kind of a win there.
This last year, I did some work with the Oklahoma Wheat Commission, and I asked Dr. Amanda Silva, who's a small grain specialist there at OSU, I said, can you rank the importance of variety selection, moisture, and planting date? And she said, from 1 to 3, most important would be moisture. And the second would be planting date, and then variety selection. Because Oklahoma State University puts out a lot of different varieties, and they're a patchwork for the state. You know, this one's going to work really well in this area, and this one in this area. And that's why I included the variety selection in there. And she said the moisture, that's going to make the crop, and then the planting date. And she saw that from field to field, from county to county. And I think that played as much in it because, you know, if you, like you said, if you're going in with the goal of having some forage if you need it, I think in Oklahoma we saw that, and that was kind of an exit opportunity for many producers. But the need for grain, I mean, that's the reason why you're putting it in the ground.
Interestingly, our breeder colleague of mine, Greg Rubetsky, he does what I think of as breeding for system resilience rather than breeding for crop resistance. So there's a lot of work going on around the world, and it's good that people are chasing this, but it's a tough ask to make wheat heat resistant and frost resistant, right? That's a tough breeding challenge. What you can do is work with the climate and find ways to still make money even when bad things happen. So he's bred wheat with a long coleoptile, so we can plant that down at sort of 4 inches, because often the moisture's there. You can get it up and get it established, you know, when current modern wheats, semi-dwarf wheats, often you can't. He's bred a wheat which produces hay, high quality hay, and it's awnless. So that's for growers who, when they get frosted, have still got a high value product. Like, it's not just any old wheat hay. It's as good as the oaten hay that they sell to Japanese racehorses. And without the awns, it makes good hay. So that's another one. And the third thing, he's working on 100-day wheats, where he's been selecting for early vigour, and he's now got wheat that's as vigorous as barley early. So that's when you really get pushed into late June and July, but you still want to get a crop with a profitable yield. So all of those things are sort of saying, well, this climate's going to happen, and we need to still be able to make money from the wheat. So what sort of breeding ideas have we got that can help make that happen? And that's been some really nice examples of that. Look, all strength for the guys looking for heat tolerance and frost tolerance, and hopefully they'll find some incremental improvements with that as well. But in the meantime, we still have to be there, and we still have to make money, and none of us yet can predict the climate. So got to be ready for anything.
Well, speaking of research, never ceases to amaze me the resiliency of modern wheat genetics. Had this year been 30 years ago, it would have been factors worse. I have no doubt about that. In the wheat tour, Romulo, we went out in the field, clearly saw the primary tillers dead. They had been smoked by the freeze, and the secondary tillers coming on, still producing ahead, and by all quality reports, decent test weights this year. And so I say it often on this show, but tip of the hat to our wheat geneticists for making small miracles happen. But 2 questions for you, Romulo. Just how close were we to a better crop? A half an inch for rain, placed at the right time. And then what does a researcher learn from a year like this?
Good questions there, Aaron. And, how close were we from a better crop? Wheat can be quite efficient in using the water if it comes in the right time, right? And I came across a few fields in the central quarter of the state that were looking really good for the crop that we had, for the year that we had, particularly in that north central part of the state, Republic County. I was talking to the farmer. He said, well, yeah, he did get a couple of rainfall events of about half an inch or so each, maybe a little bit more, that really saved the crop, right? And so you went there, you probably put 20 bushels in that crop from that couple of inches of rainfall or so that you could have had. So essentially, if we look at how efficient the wheat can be in using water, if it is water limited, right? If you have 30 inches of rainfall in the season, it doesn't matter. But if you are in that limited environment, right? If you have 8, 10 or something along those lines, it can put up to about 8 bushels per inch, more or less, in its potential, right? So if it comes in the right time, and if you have good genetics, and if the agronomic management is on the background, that's kind of like the potential that wheat has. And in Australia, they use that as a benchmark very often. It's like growers know that number in the top of their minds, and they're always trying to see how close to that benchmark they are. So this year, we happen to be very, very water limited in an important stage of development of the crop. And if we would have had, again, for each additional inch we could have put about 8 bushels or so. So yes, that's kind of how close we were from saving that crop. Was probably a couple of inches in the right moment, spread across a couple of different rainfall events. A couple or 3 inches would have made, these would have been multi-million-dollar rainfall events there. From a research perspective, I guess what we learned, it's dealing with these adversities, right? What can we try to do to improve growers' decision in an environment like this? And I think that's kind of where our applied research is. Our plots go through the same constraints that growers are going through out there, and so we look back in the data and we try to see, okay, well, what would have been the best management to have taken this season, right? And we can always do that. It's of course, it's much easier looking back in a set of research plots and seeing what worked best and what didn't than if you're a grower trying to plan ahead and trying to make a decision from 1,000 different outcomes, right? But I guess that's where we're at. I'll give an example and try one of the projects that I have a student working full-time on is try to see how can we better manage our nitrogen decision, right? Because that's one of the biggest inputs that the wheat grower has in their operation. And so essentially what we're doing is if we're getting hundreds of trials that we've run over the last few years, we're getting the date when we did the nitrogen application, February or March, right? And we're looking at weather to date in each one of those trials and then doing a prediction of all the different yield outcomes we would have had in the last 30 years in that location. So essentially, based on the weather in the last 30 years, in that point in time, right, in February or March, when we're making the decision, what's the weather and what's the probability they're going to reach to a given yield potential so we can make an informed nitrogen decision. So again, years like these, they are really tough. It's very hard to make money on it. We do have learnings from a research perspective that then we can actually look back and say, well, probably this year, just as little input would have been probably the most profitable out there. One quick comment that I have, since we have Dave and John here in the call as well, and we were talking about all the things that the crop went through. I also have a very short story because we were visiting with Amanda Silva in late April, took John there. And as we were driving back, we didn't mention, but another thing that the wheat crop went through, right, this season was tornadoes. So we were driving back from Oklahoma in the day when Enid got that tornado, late April. And I've never seen such a scared Australian before. as we were driving and trying to come to Manhattan. I even changed the route that I was driving. I felt, John, you felt more comfortable.
Hey, there was one in Manhattan because your wife rang and said she was in the shelter, and there's one coming behind us in Enid, and we were in the middle. I was thinking, gee, I better trust this guy from Brazil in this big truck, knows what he's doing.
You got a Brazilian trying to escape tornadoes with an Australian. Yeah, you see how that goes.
Well, Romulo, this is ironic because the first year you were on the wheat tour, your father came along and you were in a car with me and we were headed east towards Wichita, and I looked off to my left and by golly, there was a tornado. And I pointed near Greensburg, which is another level of irony, and I pointed out that tornado to them. Had I not been with people whose safety I was concerned about, I would have been chasing that thing, trying to get closer, but I did not want to scare my new Brazilian friends. So that's how we haze people in Kansas, apparently, is the tornado thing. John, I'm kind of an El Niño fanatic, and we mentioned earlier in a different conversation, but strong El Niño coming on has a very strong correlation on the southern plains, above average moisture between November and March, key for the hardwood winter growing season. Reverse effect, as you might expect for Australia, and you said your farmers even make some fertility decisions based on that.
Yeah. So El Niño for us means very dry spring conditions, and in fact this year, and it's it does add skill to the forward forecast. So farmers will look at what what's being said out ahead of time regarding El Niño. We have another weather phenomenon called the Indian Dipole, which sort of comes down from the Indian Ocean across and can also sort of pull rain down. So they're the sort of two big global weather systems that our growers are looking at. And the El Niño predictions tend to be pretty spot on in the sort of northern wheat belt, so up in Queensland. As you come further south, it gets a little bit less predictable, but still it'll push you into, more likely than not that you're going to get a below average spring. So this year the Weather Bureau, our Bureau of Meteorology, BOM in Australia, was predicting a super El Niño, they were saying.
Wow.
And so I was leaving Australia in March. That's when growers are sort of making their sowing decisions, and I've got experiments running, and we're sort of deciding what we're going to do. But I know a lot of growers were listening to this, and it was such a strong signal and such a strong recommendation that they were, some of them, holding off on nitrogen purchasing decisions based on that, which turned out not to be a good idea for two reasons. One, what happened in the Middle East and the increasing prices of fertiliser that spiked for those that didn't already have some in the shed. As it turned out, the rain sort of kept coming, and the Australian crop at the moment looks very good. So this prediction has not yet occurred. Even my friends in some of the dry mallee areas of South Australia where Romulo was based have got some beautiful looking crops set up this year. So everybody's a little surprised but grateful. It can still, from July in Australia, mid-year when we're making our nitrogen decisions, you can get anything from a 30 bushel crop to a 90 bushel crop, because the weather is that variable and that unpredictable. So who knows what will happen from here on in, but they're pretty well set up. They've got pretty full profiles of moisture. The crop's coming through, starting to elongate. So I think we're probably in some parts of Australia already there for a reasonable crop, underpinned by that stored soil moisture, even if things go as they were predicting. At the moment, it's looking pretty positive, touch wood. But that is a factor in our weather predictions that the growers will add into their thinking when they're making those decisions. Here's the seasonal forecast. Here's the El Niño signal. They will look at that seriously.
So, Dave, speaking of decisions, what's the tone, mood in Oklahoma right now? Farmers a little bit different decision making since there's a lot more grazing that goes on. I mean, what's the sense on planted acres?
The producers I talked to at the end of the crop last year, I made sure to ask them just to kind of get a feel of where they were. I said, "Are you going back next year?" And they said, I would say probably about 90% of the producers I talked to said yes. And a lot of the producers, because seed's going to be hard to find already in that part of the world, and a lot of producers were holding back seed where they could just to plant it this year. And I was glad to hear that, just as a guy who loves wheat in the Great Plains, and there's that optimism. Now, back to what you said earlier, do you think this could have been 30 years ago? Where would we be? I don't know that there would be that optimism, that readiness to jump in and do it again after a year like this. But where we are now, from the folks that I talked to in Oklahoma, I think that, there is an optimism. Like I say, we're OSU Cowboy fans, so we're ready for another good year, hopefully next year. And so that's kind of been the attitude with the folks in the great state of Oklahoma.
Same question for you, Romulo.
Yeah, that's a good question, Aaron. I think that, when you look at the Kansas context, over the last 30 years, we lost a lot of wheat area, right? But in recent years, if you just look at the last maybe, 7 or 8 years, it has been fairly stable. And I think it's because right now wheat is going to maintain at least that area, because growers know the importance of having wheat in the rotation for the type of conditions that we get here. Yes, last year was terrible for wheat last season, but there are multiple benefits that wheat brings into these rotations in semi-arid systems like we are, especially in western Kansas, right? With all of the residue that is produced, and that residue helping store soil moisture, conserve that moisture there for the next crop, snowfall, control weeds in their summer crops, and so on. So overall, I think that we're going to at least be maintaining the area that we have been at, around that 7.5, perhaps 8 million acres planted. Whether we're going to harvest all of that or not, it's a different question, right? Because it all depends on the season. And similarly to what John mentioned, in March, we may have anywhere from 15 to a 90 bushel potential, right? So that's going to be a driver of the harvested area later on. But in terms of sowing, I think that wheat holds a very important place in our crop rotations here because of these multiple benefits that it brings, the flexibility that it brings in terms of timing for the decisions and whatnot. And they had the opportunity for grazing on it as well that we don't have in many summer crops. So overall, I would expect perhaps a stable area going into this fall, owing to this importance of the wheat in our systems.
Great discussion, gentlemen. Good postmortem. Postmortem's a perfect term for the 2026 crop. I think we all agree on that.
Yeah.
And very nice to have your perspective, John.
Thank you.
And Dave, you too. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. Please share with your friends. If you want to hear previous episodes, go to wheatsonyourmind.com. Thanks for listening.